Lords of the Fallen is an immersive Souls-like game that combines fluid combat with impressive aesthetics and music, all wrapped up in an apocalyptic package. However, Lords of the Fallen has several flaws that keep us from saying it's a perfect homage to the genre. Compared to the first game, Lords of the Fallen 2023 is a massive upgrade to its past self. But is this game just a better version of its predecessor, or does this style prove to be something more, able to even reach the top of the Souls-like genre? Join us here at GameMate as we review 2023's Lords of the Fallen. This is the video adaptation of our review over at our website. Click the link in the description to read the full review. Lords of the Fallen is set eons after vanquishing the Demon Lord Adir in the original Lords of the Fallen released back in 2014. Lords seemingly do not fall forever, however, as the resurrection of Adir draws near. And should he resurrect, the realms are bound to experience another age of cruel tyranny. As one of the Dark Crusaders, you must journey through both the realms of the living and the dead to carve a path of either light or dark so that you may overthrow the Demon Lord. As with many other games in the Souls-like genre, Lords of the Fallen does not willingly reveal its story to you. Rather, you have to go out of your way to figure out what's going on in Mournhold, aside from the impending return of Adir the Demon Lord. That means talking to NPCs and reading item descriptions. Most item descriptions are also gated by an investment into the Radiant stat, the equivalent to intelligence in this game, which is something you may or may not need depending on your playstyle. Still, the game does a fair job of revealing what you should know about the plot to progress. It's also a fairly good story that leaves you to grapple with the moral implications of your in-game choices.
Prove yourself worthy of this gift.
Lords of the Fallen's general gameplay progression follows the style of the original Dark Souls games. Mournhold's game world is designed kind of like a central hub, with all areas of the map converging to a central point. Your progression through each area is defined by paths that may lead you back to places you've visited before. One of the tweaks we see made to the Souls-like formula is through the Vestiges system. If you want to use the Vestiges, which are the game's equivalent of bonfires, you can do so and warp between them instead. These interconnections make Mournhold feel like an open world experience, even if it's actually more like a Metroidvania than anything else, given the many shortcuts you'll find to old and new areas. Even in the individual areas, the great map design is on full display. It never takes too long for you to come across a ladder you can pull down or a plank that you can kick in order to create a shortcut between you and the vestige you came from earlier, making future treks into that area that much easier. One thing that messes with the pacing of the game are the implementation of vestiges. Instead of having permanent bonfires or vestiges in areas across Mournhold, the powers that be in Lords of the Fallen seem to prefer money, charging you for saving your game. So instead of running across the map and finding multiple bonfires, you'll have to go out of your way to find and buy a vestige seedling, an item that plants a temporary vestige for you to rest and respawn at. These items, however, are few and far between, and with how many bosses and dungeons there are in Lords of the Fallen, you'll need all the vestige seedlings you can get. This pretty much leaves you with one option: to buy vestige seedlings for 2,500 vigor from one of the NPCs at the main hub area. Early in the game, that amount of vigor is enough for one level already, so instead of progressing and leveling up your character, you'll have to put aside precious vigor to buy a temporary checkpoint that you may not even end up needing. In the end, all this does is damage the game's pacing even further by making grinding somewhat a necessity. Just enough to make sure you have enough vestige seedlings on hand when you're far into a dungeon and don't want to lose your progress. Contrary to the vestige seedlings hampering the experience, what expands Lords of the Fallen's world even further is the Umbral Lantern mechanic. You see, when you die in-game, you're brought to the Umbral, a kind of mirror dimension of death that closely reflects the living dimension of Axiom. It isn't until you die again in the Umbral where you'll be down for good and be required to respawn. While in the Umbral, you'll notice that there are a few key differences from Axiom. Aside from the change in visuals with the whole spooky and grotesque design, things like stairs, ladders, and walkways will appear in areas that didn't have them in the realm of the living, giving you access to new locations, and basically acting somewhat of a puzzle. It's this dual world dynamic that allows you to explore beyond death, and gives you several options to dealing with obstacles in your way. In 2023, Souls-like combat has already been tried, tested, and standardized many times. You go up to an enemy, die, learn their attack patterns, die, dodge or parry their attacks with the perfect timing, die a couple of hundred more times, then proceed to wail on them. Lords of the Fallen does this very well. All the weapons have decent animations that aren't too slow but aren't too fast either. The enemy movesets can range from very obvious to somewhat erratic, but none of them enter the realm of being unfair. What Lords of the Fallen does to separate itself from other Souls-like combat is the utility of the Umbra Lantern. As mentioned earlier, the Umbra Lantern is going to be a key item in your playthrough. Aside from the exploration aspect, it also introduces a new combat mechanic called Soulflay. By using the lantern, you can pull out the physical manifestation of an enemy soul, giving you an opening to deal a massive amount of damage. Another thing you use it for is to deal with umbral parasites. Some enemies have umbral parasites, bugs that keep them alive, and they can't die until you purge those parasites with your lamp. The Umbra Lantern is definitely a unique and cool aspect of the game that really helps differentiate Lords of the Fallen from its Souls-like contemporaries. One of the major problems with the game is that certain areas are just crawling with enemies, especially in the early game areas. This means that if you want to explore these zones thoroughly and find all the loot you want, you'll have to systematically clear these areas one enemy at a time. Of course, clearing areas is part of any Souls-like game, but most games keep the enemy counts at reasonable level. Lords of the Fallen clearly does not believe in that, and so they send several enemies at once, making it somewhat tedious rather than being difficult. Very quickly, you'll realize that no matter how careful you are, there's always the risk of being overwhelmed, and that facing all of them is just not worth the effort. Some players may just opt to run through the map, ignoring its secrets, which completely undermines the exploration aspect of the game. The frequency of boss encounters can also be a problem, as the game can feel a bit boss rushy at times. Maybe there are those who like this kind of pacing, but even then, it felt a bit much. For example, on a bridge heading to Calrath, we are confronted by a demon called Ruiner, and defeating him allowed us to continue to a ruined fort. There, we encountered yet another boss named the Light Reaper. Beat him, continue on, eventually leading us to the Calrath slums. And here, you guessed it, we faced another boss, the Infernal Enchantress. That's essentially 3 big boss fights within an hour of the game. Boss fights are fun and everything, but we wish Hexworks would have given us some time to simply breathe between boss battles. Just let us take in those moments of quiet after frenzy. While there's way too many bosses all in a row, if you look at the opposite side of that same coin, Lords of the Fallen is jam-packed full of content. If you take your time beating enemies, taking on all of the bosses, and looking for items, you have a game that is a very solid Souls-like experience. Lords of the Fallen was made with Unreal Engine 5, and it shows. All the environments in the game are beautifully detailed, from the cathedral-like spires of Skyrest Bridge, to the swamps of the Forsaken Fen, and even the burnt-out ruins of Calrath. The various enemies you face all look menacing in their own way, and you're no slouch yourself with all the cool-looking armor sets you can collect. The game succeeds in pulling off the dark gothic fantasy look that the genre is known for, and it's great that it's also aesthetically cohesive. Nothing looks out of place. Unfortunately, although Lords of the Fallen may be a next-gen Souls-like, it suffers from performance issues. For context, we played the PS5 version, so the bugs we mention here may or may not be exclusive to that version. First off, there's a slowdown in terms of frame rate on the PS5. Even in performance mode, the game hits 60 FPS 9 times out of 10. Definitely not unplayable, of course, but considering that the PS5 is one of this generation's most powerful consoles, you'll have to wonder whether the people at Hexworks are still having trouble optimizing the games on Unreal Engine 5. Aside from that, there are some graphical glitches. For example, on day 1, there would be missing textures when you'd proc a bleed effect, and you would see these checkered black and white boxes spew from the enemy instead. It's worth noting that they did patch this after a day or two, but bigger issues like the occasional frame drops can be extremely frustrating, especially in boss fights. The music in Lords of the Fallen has really strong religious overtones, which matches with how the game is presented as kind of a crusade against heretics and sinners. War drums, Gregorian chanting, and violence give a sense of urgency, while slithering snakes, ghostly whispers, and sudden violent creaks evoke a sense of fear and dread. The soundtrack gives every place in Mournhold a vibe that everything is very corrupted and has to be purged, or embraced should you choose to do so. Lords of the Fallen masterfully encapsulates the ambience of the Dark Souls franchise, from which it draws inspiration. It impeccably crafted a dark and ominous atmosphere, and an ever-present sense of foreboding, hopelessness, and trepidation as you push deeper into the tainted kingdom of Mournhold. Despite its flaws, we're giving Lords of the Fallen 2023 an 8 out of 10, as it does a good job of being a tribute to the genre. We're excited to see what this franchise can do in the future, and until we review that game, this has been GameMate signing off.
You are not welcome here.